On January 21st, 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch entered his clinic in Nome, Alaska, sat down, and put his head in his hands. 2 children were dead, and more would follow. Earlier that month, he had admitted a 3-year-old boy named Billy Barnett with a sore throat, fever, and fatigue. Welch hoped it was tonsillitis, but Billy soon developed thick, gray lesions in his throat that were the hallmarks of another disease. And while initial treatments had seemed to work, by 4 p.m. on January 20th, Billy started coughing up blood. By 6 p.m., his airway began to close up. Later that evening, Welch could do nothing but watch the boy die, struggling for air. And on the morning of the 21st, Welch woke up to even worse news. Another child, a 7-year-old Inuit girl named Bessie Stanley, had identical symptoms. Once again, Welch could do nothing to save her. Both children's symptoms matched a particular disease, the strangling angel, diphtheria. And with 2 separate cases back to back, this was no coincidence. This was the start of an outbreak in the tiny town of Nome. Isolated from the rest of the world, with the next closest doctor 10 days away, every child in the town and surrounding villages was in danger. But this story has a happy ending, relatively speaking, thanks to an incredible, death-defying journey by a relay race of sled dogs and the people driving them. It was so incredible, it's been immortalized in several forms. One of the dogs got taxidermied and put in a Cleveland museum, and Steven Spielberg's production company made an animated kids movie about it back in 1995. Yes, I am talking about Balto, both the taxidermy and the movie. And if you're of a certain age, there's a good chance that you've seen that film at least once. Your parents might even still have the VHS in their basement. But SciShow's editorial team rewatched it while writing this episode, and I hate to break it to you, but it's almost entirely made up. There were, for example, no talking polar bears. So what really happened? How did people get life-saving medication to the children of Nome in the dead of winter, 1925? I'm Maya Higa, and I share stories from my animal sanctuary every week on YouTube. A lot of amazing things happen at Alvea's sanctuary, but thankfully nothing quite as dramatic as the tale I'm about to tell. I'm going to introduce you to the real Balto, and along the way we're going to meet the sled dogs that have been a critical part of human life in the Arctic for thousands of years. Located roughly 230 kilometers from the Arctic Circle on Alaska's Seward Peninsula, Nome is one of the most isolated cities in North America. Well, city is probably the wrong word. Originally a settlement by the local indigenous people known as the Inupiat or Alaskan Inuit, Nome's population surged to a whopping 20,000 people in the summer of 1901, a few years after gold was discovered in a nearby creek. But by 1925, when Dr. Welch's story started, Nome had already become a relic, a sleepy settlement of about 1,400. The wooden houses, churches, and offices strung up with telephone wires were set against the treeless Arctic tundra. And of course, there were a bunch of dogs.
The thing to understand about Nome at that time, and really a lot of northern places at that time, is that sled dogs, in the same way that our society now is built around cars, Nome at the time was built around sled dogs.
That's Blair Braverman, a long-distance dog sledder and writer.
I got into dog sledding when I was a teenager. I graduated high school in California, and I immediately moved to the Norwegian Arctic to become a dog sledder. And that was 19 years ago. I've been doing it ever since. I've done some of the biggest dog sled races in the world. 200 miles, 400 miles, 1,000 miles. I've done the Iditarod. I've done the Kobuk 440, the Canadian Challenge, the Bear Grease. Just some really big dog sled races. The first time I heard about the Serum Run, I was a kid in California, and I had a little book, and it was called Balto, the Bravest Dog Ever. And I loved it. Like, I read it to shreds. And I sort of credit that book for why I got into mushing, because as I got older, I started reading other dog sledding books, and I realized it wasn't just a thing that belonged to the past. It was a thing that people were doing now. And it involved dogs, and it involved wilderness, and it involved teamwork and self-reliance and building this incredible trust and communication with your team of dogs. And I was like, that is too good to be true. Like, can I really pursue that?
And like the story suggested, Nome really was kind of a dog-centric place.
Sled dogs they would go into bars with people. That's how you would get from roadhouse to roadhouse or go to your friend's house. There's everyone had sled dogs in their yard. They all had their own teams. And these weren't beasts of burden. They were just incredibly beloved key members of the community.
And with the dogs came mushers, the people who drive the dog sleds. Among them was Leonard Seppala, who lived in town with his wife and 8-year-old daughter.
Seppala was a legendary musher at the time. I know he and his lead dog Togo had mushed 55,000 miles together. They had just dealt with everything. He knew the trails, he knew how to cross sea ice, he knew how to deal with wildlife, the depth of understanding that he had with his dogs, the communication he was able to have with them, the way he was able to help his dogs have what they needed to do the most extraordinary things with him was really unparalleled.
In 1925, Seppala was already famous for winning many sled dog races, but his official job was working for a local gold mine company as their main sled dog musher, helping ferry people and supplies between dig sites. Among the mine's kennels were 2 dogs who would each get movies named after them. There was Togo, who was played by one of his descendants acting alongside Willem Dafoe in a 2019 live-action movie for Disney+, and there was also Balto, because unlike the animated movie, Balto was not a wild wolf dog living in a shipwreck with a Russian goose, and who continued living in that shipwreck for 2 direct-to-video sequels. Now, it's important to note that up in Nome, dog sleds weren't just a way for folks to get around town and to go to work. They were also one of the town's few connections to the outside world. There were no roads or railways out of town. Instead, people relied on 2 options. One was a system of dog sled trails that stretched over 1,000 kilometers east to the railroad town of Nenana. This route was studded with other small towns and the occasional rest house, and took about 25 days to cross. In the winter, it was the only way to transport mail and supplies. But dog sleds can only carry so much weight, so during the warmer months of the year, much of the traffic to Nome came the second way: steamships. As long as Nome's port was ice-free, these could chug up from ports like Anchorage to dock at the harbor and offload supplies or the occasional visitor. And while we can't say for certain, it's on such a ship that diphtheria may have traveled. Diseases weren't uncommon out on the frontier, but diphtheria was particularly deadly.
Back in the early 1900s, diphtheria was, I think, around the 4th or 6th highest cause of death in the US, with most of those deaths occurring in children under 5 years old.
That's Sean Truelove, an epidemiologist and infectious disease researcher at Johns Hopkins University. He studies disease outbreaks and how we might find new ways to prevent them in the future.
I first learned about the serum run, maybe it was about that, thinking about, like the movie Balto, right? But really, the first time I really understood the details of it was during this review and analysis of diphtheria.
In 2020, Truelove and some colleagues wrote a major paper that rounded up what we knew about how diphtheria attacks the body and spreads.
You look at some of the papers and some of the common knowledge that we have really kind of relied on for response to these outbreaks. I realized that it was quite out of date because we really hadn't thought about this disease for a long time.
Though diphtheria is rare today, back in Dr. Welch's time, it was a major killer. During an epidemic in 1921, the United States had more than 200,000 cases and 15,000 deaths. It was especially deadly for little kids, with a 20% mortality rate for anyone under 5 years old. For it to show up a few years later in the tiny town of Nome was terrifying. As for the actual culprit behind the disease, we're dealing with a bacteria called Corynebacterium diphtheriae.
When someone gets diphtheria, the disease progression looks a lot like other bacterial respiratory tract infections for a time. There will be kind of the typical runny nose, sore throat, cough, that kind of thing. But as the disease progresses, in a lot of cases, patients or cases will develop what's called membranous diphtheria, where they'll develop a membrane in their throat that actually ends up obstructing their breathing, and that's one of the leading causes of death.
This gray, leathery, foul-smelling membrane is the terrible hallmark that Welch had seen in the throats of the first Nome children who had gotten sick. It's made of dead throat tissue cells, killed by a toxin the bacteria secrete. Although oddly, the bacteria only secrete the stuff if they are also infected, this time with a bacteria-targeting virus. That's right, diphtheria is so bad, even the bacteria that cause diphtheria are sick. The technical term for one of these viruses is a bacteriophage. And one of the things bacteriophages do is they insert bits of their own genetic code into the DNA of the bacterial cell they infect. They basically hijack the cell and force it to start making a bunch of proteins so the virus can replicate. In C. diphtheriae's case, one of those proteins turns out to be toxic for humans, chickens, guinea pigs, and more. Scientists just call it diphtheria toxin, or DT. Today, there are 3 potential tools for dealing with diphtheria. The first is a vaccine. It was first rolled out across the US a few years after that 1921 epidemic I mentioned, but it's not clear how much, if any, vaccine got all the way to Nome. The second is antibiotics.
We have 3 that work against it: penicillin, erythromycin, and clindamycin. But those weren't developed. Penicillin wasn't discovered until 1928, so this is well after the Nome incident.
So at the time of the Nome outbreak, they really only had the third option: antitoxin. An antitoxin is kind of like how we have antivenom for snake bites, just instead of snake venom, it's that bacterial toxin.
So it neutralizes the toxin. And with diphtheria, all of the disease, well, I can't say all of it, but most of the disease, especially the severe disease that's caused by diphtheria, is caused by the toxin that it secretes. So that was developed starting in like the 1890s. And what's actually super interesting and funny about this, the whole process to develop antitoxin for diphtheria relies on us to inject horses with the toxin and then extract this molecule that the horse developed to neutralize the toxin. We still use that same process today.
The molecule that True Love is talking about is an antibody made by the horse's immune system in response to getting poisoned. Scientists simply had to collect blood from the horse and separate out the antibody-rich serum. Now, this antitoxin isn't a silver bullet. It doesn't kill the bacteria, it doesn't stop the spread, and it doesn't heal the damage the toxin's already done. But if administered early enough, it can help prevent further damage and give the patient time for their own immune system to do its thing. By 1925, it was common for doctors, even doctors in very remote areas, to have some antitoxin on hand. But up in Nome, there was a problem. The year before, in 1924, Dr. Welch had noticed his supply had expired. And while he had ordered a replacement batch, the package never came. After he realized he was dealing with diphtheria, Welch tried giving some of the expired antitoxin to Bessie Stanley, but it didn't work. Maybe she was too far gone by the time he got there. Maybe, more than a year past its expiration date, it had lost its potency. But even if the antitoxin had worked, he only had enough for maybe 6 people at most. And while 1,400 is not a large number as far as town populations go, it's definitely more than 6. So as soon as Welch got back from seeing Bessie, he picked up the phone and called Nome's mayor. Together, they gathered the town council and came up with a plan. The first step was quarantine, immediately. They even sent someone to go shut down a card game party that was going on that night. That would hopefully stop the spread of the disease, but it wouldn't save the who knows how many people who were already infected. Then, Welch and the mayor sent a desperate call for more antitoxin down the telegraph lines. The US government responded. If they pooled together everything they could possibly spare, they could send about 1.1 million units of the antitoxin. That sounds like a lot, but 1.1 million units was only enough to treat maybe 50 cases of diphtheria, max. Units are a measurement of the antitoxin's potency, not a number of doses. Hopefully that much would be enough to cover all of the severe infections, but it would take time to round up the medicine and send it northwards. There was a bit of good news though. 300,000 additional units were found forgotten and stored in Anchorage, which, while over 800 kilometers away as the crow flies, was at least in Alaska. While that wasn't nearly as much as Welch wanted, it would save those in mortal peril and buy time for a larger stockpile to arrive. But this small supply still had to get to Nome. The question was, how? It was January, the harbor was frozen over, so a ship was out of the question. The mayor wanted to take advantage of an emerging technology and send the shipment by airplane, but a variety of problems, like the fact that antifreeze hadn't been invented yet, meant it was way too dangerous. So there was only one answer to that question. And if you've picked up on the incredibly subtle foreshadowing we've been laying down so far, you already know what that answer is. In contrast to the airplane, dog sledding may actually be one of humanity's oldest technologies.
The history of sled dogs in the Arctic goes back almost as far as the history of people in the Arctic.
In 1989 and 1990, on Zhukov Island in Siberia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of what seemed to be domesticated dogs. They're roughly 9,500 years old.
Not only were they, dog remains there, but there was also evidence of sleds and harnesses that were still there. So they knew to a pretty good extent that these must have been used for sledding purposes.
That's Heather Husson, an associate professor at Cornell University who studies animal genetics. Some of that research includes looking at working dog breeds and investigating how they've evolved over centuries, if not millennia, of artificial selection. And like Blair Braverman, Husson also has firsthand experience with racing sled dogs.
Both of my parents raced sled dogs. I started racing when I was about 8 years old. We would train together and we would travel every weekend in the winter to different races around the US and Canada. I went to Alaska when I was first a teenager, and I raced up there in Fairbanks, and I lived up there for 6 years, raced dogs, worked, did research, and I had every intention of staying there except for work brought me back. to the East Coast.
As part of that work, Husan learned one particularly cool thing about sled dog genetics. There are official breeds of dogs, like Siberian Huskies or Alaskan Malamutes, that have been selectively bred for a specific look and can be used as sled dogs. But when you look at the Alaskan sled dogs that actually pull many of these teams, they're not quite as copy-paste. They're a motley crew of different colors, coat lengths, ear shape, just a ragtag team.
When I started my PhD, I was doing the genetics of sled dogs, and one of my questions was, what is their ancestry? You know, how much is a Siberian Husky versus an Alaskan Malamute or a Greyhound? And the big thing that we found was sled dogs are their own breed.
So even though they aren't a recognized registered breed, they've been selected for the last 100 years just like every other breed, but they're selected for their performance. These hardworking good boys and girls have been bred over generations, not for looks, but for their sled hauling, cold-enduring abilities. And this selection has modified their DNA in detectable ways.
One of the really cool mutations that has been explored in dogs through domestication and across species is the amylase gene. So amylase produces basically a protein or an enzyme that digests starch. So starch is a big part of our diet nowadays. But if you think historically, you know, if we think about a wolf, you know, the primary diet of a wolf is going to be meat and meat proteins. For a wolf, they typically will have about 2 copies of this amylase gene. And then what has been found is Arctic breed dogs have about 7 to 10 copies of this amylase gene, where basically every other dog breed has up to 20 copies or so of this amylase gene. So there is a huge difference between how many copies of the amylase gene from wolves to Arctic dogs to basically every other dog. Arctic peoples eat a very high meat protein diet, and their dogs are eating that same type of diet. Whereas all of the other dogs, they grew up, you know, as people, you know, evolved and had more farming and agriculture. Those dogs were exposed to more of those types of foods as well. So their diets had more starch in them.
Another cool genetics revelation is that scientists have tied modern sled dogs all the way back to those Zhukov Island animals, meaning those ancient dogs may be their direct ancestors. As for when sled dogs got to Alaska, it seems like they've been running around North America for at least 1,000 years. While there were some dogs in the North American Arctic before this, archaeological evidence suggests that they were relatively rare and not used for sledding, not until the ancestors of today's Inuit emerged in western Alaska. This group, called the Thule culture, began to spread out and eventually displace the people known as the Dorset about 1,000 years ago, probably assisted by their invention of the kayak and the use of dog sled on land. Hundreds of years later, when Alaska's gold rush hit, sled dogs proved essential.
During the gold rush, people brought every animal they could think of that might be able to transport things, but sled dogs are what worked.
In fact, it was said the demand for sled dogs was so high, people would kidnap sturdy-looking dogs off the streets of any West Coast port town and send them to Alaska. Then that diverse group of dogs would breed the next generation. Husan has seen evidence of this mixing. One notable piece of evidence, Balto himself. Because while Balto died back in 1933, he's still with us, in taxidermy form.
I was talking to veterinarian Jerry Van Eck, who is a sled dog veterinarian and a history buff. And he put out the opportunity, would I be interested in sequencing Balto's DNA? And of course I was like, why not? This sounds cool. Jerry knew some of the curators at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and the Cleveland Museum is where Balto's hide has been preserved for years. They were willing to provide a small amount of skin and hair sample from Balto's belly on his preserved hide, and that's how we ended up sequencing Balto's DNA. One of the highlights in sequencing Balto's genome was understanding that, you know, he had less deleterious or negative mutations than a lot of our modern breed dogs do now. And that was probably because the dogs then, you know, they were a much more diverse population of dogs.
But you know what Husan and her team didn't find?
One of the things that we could very clearly identify using Balto's genome, Balto was not a wolf hybrid. So there was no wolf in Balto. Balto was definitely a domesticated dog.
That's right. The entire reason why movie Balto was such an outcast from society, forced to sleep on a shipwreck with a Russian goose, wasn't true. Okay, to be fair, the paper announcing this genetic discovery was published in 2023, which is 9 years after the last Balto movie came out. And to be clear, they didn't pull this falsehood out of nowhere. Some historical accounts also made the half-wolf claim, and there are accounts that Inuit or other people in Alaska may have encouraged hybridization with wolves. But as Husan told us, Balto was definitely a domesticated dog. In fact, she thinks hybridization probably wasn't super common. While wolves are tough, social animals, they're not as good as sled dogs at running long distances. And even if they are more social, they can also be more conflict prone.
Could it have happened maybe intentionally or unintentionally? Maybe, occasionally, who knows? But is it really common and is it very intentional? No.
Now, thanks to this long history of living and working in the Arctic, sled dogs have a number of physical adaptations that make them champions at surviving through cold conditions.
Sled dogs have double coats, so they have long guard hairs that function almost as like a windbreaker or a raincoat. They keep moisture out, and then they have really fluffy, downy fur underneath that. So it's a super insulating dual layer fur that is able to keep them completely warm in really cold temperatures. Sometimes it'll be like 10 below and I'll go outside and none of my dogs are in their houses. Like every single one of them is just lounging in the snow, and there'll be snow falling on them and they're just rolling over and like putting their belly up and just think it's the most comfortable thing in the world.
Scientists have also found changes in genes related to their ability to sense temperature and pain, as well as how much oxygen their muscles need. And in 2005, scientists discovered that some sled dogs have another remarkable adaptation, which helps them run for hours without ever getting tired.
After a couple hundred miles of dog sledding, you can feel the dogs change. They go into this mode where they're sort of just able to go forever. They're not getting tired, they're not slowing down, they're just like, it's almost machine-like, and it's very uncanny to see. Scientists call that flipping a metabolic switch, and mushers call it going trail hard.
The researchers who uncovered this switch ran a series of 160-kilometer-long mock sled races and took tiny samples of the dog's leg muscles after each one. For the first few days, it was clear that the muscles were accessing energy stores inside of them. Specifically, sugar macromolecule called glycogen. That's basically the same thing that our own muscles do. But rather than bleeding those glycogen stores dry and leaving the dogs utterly exhausted, the muscles eventually switched to using something outside of them. The researchers behind that 2005 discovery proposed that the muscles could be pulling fat molecules out of the blood and burning them instead. However, more recent research argues that while fat does play an important role in preventing fatigue, the dogs aren't burning that fat directly. For example, a paper from 2021 hypothesizes it's a complicated process that starts in the liver, featuring a bunch of different molecules including fats and sugars, which we don't have time to get into right now because we have to get back to Nome. To make the long journey through the Alaskan wilderness and deliver the antitoxin, Nome sled dogs were going to need all of these adaptations because they were about to attempt something few animals could survive. Fans of the movie Balto may recall that the dog Balto wasn't actually on the team that set out from Nome to pick up the serum in the town of Nenana. And that much is true. In reality, the serum run was a 1,000-kilometer relay, as in multiple mushers and multiple teams of sled dogs. The governor of Alaska sent messages to Nome, the post office in Nenana, and a trading company that also did mail delivery to find the best mushers that they could along the route, and set up a relay. Only then would he send the serum northwards by train. Up and down the trail, mushers, some of whom had just finished runs of their own, or who were struggling with poverty, or were the renowned racer Leonard Seppala, stepped up for this volunteer mission. And when that train got to Nenana, on the evening of January 27th, the first musher, a male runner, miner, and trapper named Wild Bill Shannon, was already there to meet it. A more cautious man would have waited for morning to depart with the antitoxin, but Wild Bill, true to his name, set off that same night, reportedly saying, "Hell, if people are dying, let's get started." He might have regretted that decision. As a general rule at the time, sledders wouldn't go out if the temperature was below negative 40 degrees Celsius. But for this time of year and place, temperatures on the ground could be negative 50 degrees Celsius. And if you've never been in this kind of weather, it's incomprehensibly cold. Just a few years earlier, in similar conditions, a trapper lost both his feet to frostbite after accidentally getting his boots wet. By the time he was able to run, then walk, then hobble, 2.5 kilometers to the nearest telegraph station, his feet were beyond saving.
The amount of clothing you need to be mushing in 20, 30, 50 below is so categorically different from anything you'd wear when you're in a city and you're going ultimately from one building to another. It's like you're carrying a building with you around your body. So I want to show you my mushing mittens, and these are very typical. Every musher has mittens like this. Some of them are made out of different fur. I made these out of beavers that my dogs ate. This would be sort of like standard mushing wear. These have nipples.
But the biting cold wasn't the only foe these teams had to face. There were all kinds of hazards along the trail, like thin ice over frozen rivers. And between the dark and falling snow, there was often almost zero visibility. But ultimately, the biggest threat during the Nome Serum run was time. Normally, the sled dog route between Nenana and Nome would take at least 25 days. And if the weather turned really bad, well, the mushers would just hunker down where they were and wait it out, even if they were out on the trail.
You can basically just hole up in a snow cave at any time and wait out the weather. So what made the Serum run different is that they were not able to do that because they knew that the lives of children depended on their ability to push as hard as they possibly could.
Even if the children back in Nome could wait that delay out, their life-saving medicine couldn't. The serum was kept in glass vials, so it couldn't be allowed to freeze solid or it'd expand and break the glass, ruining the batch. The solution that the mushers implemented was relatively straightforward. Bundle the package in heavy insulation and just book it to the next roadhouse, which were kind of like small log cabin inns or rest stops with a stove inside, where they could rewarm the vials in front of the fire.
So they were pushing through conditions that it went against their instincts to mush in because they had no choice. They were trying to save the lives of these children.
While Shannon could brush off the cold at the start of his journey, eventually his limbs and face became numb, and his movements grew sluggish. At one point, he even jumped off the sled and jogged alongside the dogs in an effort to warm up, but it wasn't enough. Shannon was becoming hypothermic. Hypothermia is a dangerous drop in body temperature. To conserve heat around the important internal organs, the brain, the heart, the classics, the body will shunt blood away from the extremities. Early symptoms can include shivering and increased heart rate as the body tries to warm itself, but soon muscles become hard to control. Balance suffers, memory and judgment become impaired as the brain starts to cool and blood flow slows. In severe hypothermia, people have even been known to act irrationally, walking in circles or even taking off their clothes. Eventually, they go into a kind of stupor, curl up, fall unconscious, and die. When Shannon finally stumbled into the roadhouse in the town of Minto, it was 3 a.m. He'd gone 48 kilometers, and it was negative 52 degrees Celsius. Parts of his face had turned black from frostbite. According to some reports, it was weeks before he could touch his face without feeling pain. Even some of his dogs, for all of their adaptations to the cold, also had frostbite. This night had pushed them to their limits. Some also had blood in their mouths from what mushers back then called lung scorch. This is likely what today's doctors would call pulmonary hemorrhage. When it's colder than negative 50 degrees Celsius, even breathing in air can be dangerous. It's so cold, it irritates and damages the inside of the airways. And yes, it can be fatal. After resting a few hours and allowing the serum to rewarm by the fire, Bill Shannon, his face still black with frostbite, went back out into the cold to complete his leg of the journey. He left 3 of his dogs behind, all of whom died from their injuries. Shannon would mush another 35 kilometers and pass off the serum to Edgar Callens in the town of Tolovana around 11 a.m. on January 28th. In total, Wild Bill Shannon had gone roughly 83 kilometers in just over 12 hours, and the first leg of the race was over. But before we get to the longest and arguably most dangerous leg, let's check back in with Nome. The tiny Alaskan town had entered quarantine, as Dr. Welch requested.
Diphtheria spreads through respiratory transmission, generally speaking, and that's really what we usually worry about. It really depends on the setting and the situation, just how transmissible it is. But we do think, it has a reproductive number of somewhere in the 2s to 4s.
This means each sick person might typically go on to infect 2 to 4 other people. But in Nome, it may have been even worse.
We're talking also about a situation where people are indoors. I imagine, I wasn't around then, but that they're huddled in space where they're trying to keep warm. And so you have a lot of potential for transmission.
Welch couldn't know how many people were already sick. He was especially concerned about the villages around Nome, particularly ones where the Inuit people lived.
As we've seen throughout the history of the colonization of the Americas, right, the European settlers and populations often had immunity to a lot of the pathogens that we are, used to. Unfortunately, for the indigenous populations around Nome, most likely they had never been exposed, right? So it wouldn't just have been the children at high risk for diphtheria, potentially. It could have also been, the full population, the adults the elderly.
More people were starting to show symptoms, including Billy Barnett's 5-year-old sister and several members of Bessie Stanley's family. On top of that, 2 other adult men had sore throats. But were these an early sign of diphtheria or something less dangerous? Welch prescribed thousands of units from his limited supply of expired antitoxin, hoping it had any power left. Some of his patients were improving, some weren't. They needed the fresh antitoxin. The morning Bill Shannon passed the proverbial baton, it was time for Leonard Seppala to set out for his scheduled rendezvous point in the town of Nulato, a 500-kilometer journey. At the time, the plan was to pick up the serum and turn around and do the entire 500 kilometers back. In other words, Seppala was supposed to run roughly half of the serum run all by himself. Well, him and his dogs. Before he left Nome, Seppala left explicit instructions to his coworker, Gunnar Kaasen.
It's super, super common for mushers to have handlers or sort of younger mushers who are running their dogs, who are working at their kennel. So there really is like an apprenticeship system in the sport. So Gunnar, was a musher, but he was mushing with Seppala's dogs.
Seppala's order was that if Kaasen needed the dogs, he could take them, but to not use Balto as the leader. Another dog, Fox, was Seppala's choice. We don't know Seppala's exact reasoning, but we know that Balto was inexperienced and relatively slow, not used for fast relays, but for hauling freight. Seppala likely just thought Fox was a better lead dog.
So the lead dog runs at the very front of the team, and they have a couple responsibilities that are a lot bigger than the responsibilities of the other dogs. It's their job to find the trail. Wherever the lead dog goes, the rest of the team will follow. So if a musher has a command, if they're going to say, turn right, turn left, don't chase that reindeer, whatever they're trying to tell their dogs, the lead dog is the one they're talking to. The other thing is that sled dogs are pack animals, so they like following, they like chasing the dog in front of them. And so it's psychologically a lot harder for a sled dog to be in front of the team where they have an open trail in front of them and they're not chasing another dog's butt, so to speak. It just is more psychologically challenging, it takes more confidence, it takes more independence. And so being a lead dog isn't even something we can teach dogs, really. It's something they either are or aren't. And a lot of great sled dogs never, ever, ever run in lead because they just psychologically aren't a great fit for that role.
Now, as I mentioned, the powers that be originally wanted Seppala to do more than half the relay by himself. But after he left on January 28th, the outbreak picked up speed in Nome. More kids were getting sick, and even a champion racer would need to pace himself in order to cover 1,000 kilometers. So the governor ordered more mushers to be brought on, hoping more shorter legs and more fresh runners would speed up the pace. With Seppala already gone, they had no way to contact him. They just had to hope one of the other mushers would stop him along the trail and tell him the new plan. Seppala would no longer go all the way to Nulato, nor would he be the one to bring the serum to Nome. Nevertheless, Seppala was still assigned the longest and most dangerous stretch of the run. Over the following 3 days, as Seppala raced eastward, 16 mushers brought the life-saving package another 730 kilometers or so closer to Nome. Henry Ivanov was the one to catch Seppala outside of the town of Shaktoolik, tell him, change of plans, and hand off the medicine. And now, Seppala had to make a choice. In order to get to Shaktoolik in good time, he'd taken a shortcut across the frozen-over Norton Sound. In other words, he wasn't mushing on solid ground, but across sea ice. To meet up with the next musher in the relay, Seppala could take the safer, but much longer route around the sound, hugging the shore, or he could go back across the way he came and cross roughly 35 kilometers of sea ice. While crossing the ice had been relatively easy, it was now getting dark, and the winds were getting stronger. Exposed to the elements, the wind chill could reach negative 65 degrees Celsius. And just because he and his dogs made it safely across the ice once, didn't mean they'd do so going back. Seppala knew only too well what could happen crossing sea ice. On a previous, less important run, he'd been a few kilometers offshore when the ice beneath him suddenly fractured, stranding him, his dogs, and his whole sled on a little ice island with a 3-meter gap between him and the ice sheet. It looked like he'd be stuck on the ice floe until either the winds changed or the ice broke apart and he drowned in the Arctic Ocean. But Seppala had a plan. His idea was to tie a rope to his lead dog, Togo, throw him across the gap, and then order the dog to run forward. Hopefully, Togo would be strong enough to pull the floating ice back together. This was a huge task, but Seppala had faith in Togo. And as a lead dog, he was the best chance Seppala had. So Seppala threw Togo, and the rope came undone. But it turns out Togo was the goodest of good boys. He dove into the icy water, found the end of the rope, and pulled the ice back together with the power of his teeth, plus whatever friction his paws had against the ice below them.
The story about Togo saving the team from an ice floe is 100% plausible to me after 2 decades in mushing. I have had a couple dogs on my team who have saved my life a handful of times. I wasn't floating away on an ice floe, but there were some pretty dire situations where individual dogs sort of came up with a solution and then led the entire team through it.
There's no one way for an animal to be intelligent. Dogs, in general, seem to be very good problem solvers, although it depends on exactly what that problem is. For example, they do really well with inferring information based on social cues, especially if those cues come from a human. So if a human points at an object, the dog can understand that the human wants it. They're even better than chimpanzees at this. On the other hand, dogs aren't great at means-end experiments in laboratory settings, where they're tested on the connection between things like pull rope and get treat. But lucky for Seppala, he was not a treat. He was a person with whom Togo had a very close relationship, and the social cues likely came into play. So they both lived to tell the tale, and on January 31st, 1925, Seppala found himself in a decision-making pickle. With Serum in hand, he had to decide whether the risk of an ice break happening again was worth it. And in the end, he chose the riskier path. He and his dogs, Togo included, would cross the frozen sound. But given the hour and the miserable weather, he couldn't see where he was going. Seppala had to trust Togo was smart enough to find the way home on his own, and once again problem-solve their way out of any danger. Seppala arrived at the roadhouse in Isaacs Point several hours later. There was still another stretch of sea ice to cross, which would keep him and his dogs closer to shore, and then a whole mountain to traverse before reaching the next musher. But the most dangerous section was behind them. Seppala eventually handed the serum off to a musher named Olson, who then, 40 kilometers later at the town of Bluff, handed it off to Seppala's co-worker, Gunnar Kaasen. Kaasen wasn't originally going to take part in the relay at all. But when the governor put out a call for more mushers, they tapped him to take part. This meant Kaasen had to take the gold mines dogs out, which is to say, Seppala's dogs. But it wasn't Fox that Kaasen had chosen for his lead dog, per Seppala's instructions. It was Balto. We don't know why Kaasen went against Seppala's instructions. Disobeying another musher's orders on how to take care of their dogs was a major faux pas. But perhaps he saw something in the dog that he thought Seppala had missed. It's a good thing Seppala was wrong about Balto, because by this point in our story, the weather was just terrible. Wind gusts had reached 112 kilometers an hour, just under the speed you need for the National Weather Service to upgrade a cyclone to a hurricane. It was a proper blizzard. The weather was so bad, in fact, that sometime after Kaasen left Nome, Dr. Welch actually tried to call off the relay. If any of the mushers got lost, like what happened in the movie, the serum would freeze and be ruined, like what should have happened in the movie. Nome's mayor called ahead to the next roadhouse in Solomon and told them to stop Kaasen when they saw him. Someone also called Ed Rohn, the final musher in the relay, and told him that the race was paused because of the storm. But Kaasen never got the message. Based on his later actions, it seems like he would have ignored that order even if he had received it. With visibility so low, Kaasen and his dogs had to depend on Balto's nose and keen senses to stay on the trail, detecting the faint scent of past dogs that had run the route. As Husan and her colleagues showed the world in their 2023 research, Balto didn't need to be part wolf to do this. Domesticated dogs have a very powerful sense of smell all on their own, more than 1,000 times better than a human's. But finding the trail was only one part of the challenge. The team still had to brave the elements. Along the way, they evaded hazards like overflowing rivers that would have frozen the dogs' feet, and crawled up a mountain cliffside trail on their bellies. But coming down that mountain, disaster struck. Kaasen and the dogs passed through a sort of naturally occurring wind tunnel, basically a valley that could channel the wind down a narrow passageway and create some really intense gusts. So intense, in fact, that they lifted the sled off its runners and sent it and the dogs careening into the snowdrifts. And during the last gust he encountered, Kaasen realized the serum package had gone missing. He dropped to his hands and knees, frantic, grabbing barehanded at the snow, only to thankfully find it a moment or so later. He lashed it back to the sled and got back on the trail. Then, after finally hitting a good stretch with the wind at their backs to help push them along, Kaasen made his next controversial move. When he arrived at the roadhouse where the supposed-to-be final musher was waiting, the lights were out. Kaasen assumed the musher was sleeping. And instead of waking him and handing off the antitoxin, Kaasen pushed on towards Nome to finish the job himself. It was a dangerous move, given how many kilometers he had already logged. But Kaasen, Balto, and the rest of the dogs arrived in Nome shortly before 6 a.m. on February 2nd, just 5.5 days after the first team set out on a journey that usually takes 25 days. The story goes that Kaasen, exhausted, frostbite in his fingers, mustered the strength to stagger off the sled and walk up to Balto, whereupon he collapsed and called him a, quote, damn fine dog. But Balto was far from the only damn fine dog in this relay, and Kaasen was far from the only human. In the end, 20 mushers and 150 dogs worked together to deliver the life-saving medicine. Overall, Nome suffered 5 or 6 recorded deaths from diphtheria. There may have also been additional unrecorded deaths in neighboring native villages, but the new antitoxin serum certainly kept those numbers from being higher. Eventually, the larger package of 1.1 million units arrived from the West Coast, and the diphtheria outbreak ended. Most of the mushers involved in the serum run seemed to go back to their lives. A lot of them were locals, part of the Inuit or other native groups like the Athabaskan, and mushing was a job, after all. But Cossin and Seppala would go on to tour the country as heroes, along with their lead dogs. At least in popular culture, though, only one of those dogs seemed to get all the accolades, including a statue in Central Park, that book that inspired Blair Braverman, and, of course, a fictional movie where he got voiced by Kevin Bacon. Some newspaper coverage even credited Balto as being their lead dog through the entire race, which makes you wonder how they thought the entire race was run, and if they ignored at least 18 other human mushers, too. Seppala expressed some frustration at this. He felt that Togo, as the dog who led the team over the most miles, deserved credit too. And while he later seemed to regret some of those statements, specifically those that may have encouraged slights against the other mushers or dogs, the Balto-Togo argument still comes up today.
I think that the Togo-Balto issue is not unique to dogs. We often like to choose a solitary hero to represent something that actually required a lot of teamwork to achieve. And so if there's any lesson here, it should be not that Balto doesn't deserve his glory, but that Togo deserves it too, and so does every single participant.
After about a year of touring the country, Cossin returned to Nome and reluctantly left Balto and the rest of his dogs with the circus owner and promoter. Is that not so crazy? Unfortunately, the dogs soon wound up in a dime museum sideshow in kind of poor conditions. But in 1927, the public raised funds to buy Balto, and he lived the rest of his life in the Cleveland Zoo. He did not get to have 6 puppies with his love interest and watch one of them become the matriarch of a wolf pack, and another join a team running the mail to and from Nome, because the real-life Balto was neutered. Togo, meanwhile, was given to a breeder to live out his days in comfort. He died in 1929 at the age of 16. Today, a significant percentage of modern racing sled dogs can trace their family tree back to Togo, including our final expert on sled dogs, an actual sled dog.
First, come on. This is Togo's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandbaby, probably. She's completed the Iditarod. Come on. Come on. Wah. Stay right there. Don't keep jumping. There we go. Okay, this is Flame. She's completed the Iditarod. She's done the longest dog sled races in the world. She's placed top 5. She's very distantly related to Togo. She likes being on my lap. She's a little nervous about why she's talking to a camera.
And in case you're wondering, Flame is, in Blair Braverman's own words, not a lead dog.
Flame is a team dog, so she's just in the middle of the team. And her other role on the team is that she has never, ever, ever been dropped from a race because she's so clingy that she would not tolerate being left behind at a checkpoint. And as a result, she has mushed thousands of miles out of pure spite and jealousy because she would be too jealous if I mushed with other dogs who weren't her.
As we can see with Flame, sled dogs are still very much around, though not in the numbers they once were. Their role in everyday life has been largely supplanted by cars and snowmobiles. But they're still an important part of the culture and honored in sled dog races that continue today. And thanks to an additional century of artificial selection, evolution has continued to act on them in fascinating ways.
So modern sled dog lineages, I think the big thing that's different now is most modern sled dogs are being selected as a sporting athlete, not necessarily a working dog. So they're still considered a working dog, but the type of work has shifted a little bit. So the older sled dogs that we had, they were selected as sled dogs, but in a certain environment and for certain types of working conditions that were more of the larger freight pulling dogs, or maybe a slightly smaller, very long endurance dogs. And then compared to our modern dogs, it's all about speed. So it might be speed on top of endurance, because some of our dogs are still running extreme endurance events that reflect the original Nome Serum run. But other sled dogs are doing much shorter events that are anywhere from 3 to 30 miles.
And the sport of dog sledding now extends much farther as well. even to places without snow.
The sport has actually really expanded with kind of like people's resources and what's available. So there's actually a whole realm of what they call dry land racing. So that means you're racing on dry land. So you're racing on dirt, on grass, in the mud sometimes.
And research on them continues.
For years, I've been studying the genetics of different traits, like their speed, their endurance, their heat tolerance, what makes them a good lead dog. And we've just gotten to the point where we published some papers looking at our ability to predict these traits on sled dogs using their DNA sequence. So the idea behind it is, could you take a puppy and get a DNA sample from a puppy and be able to predict, well, this dog might make a great Iditarod dog versus this dog might be better for mid-distance or maybe even sprint. Or it could be a lead dog or versus, it should be somewhere else in the team.
Meanwhile, thanks to readily available vaccines, diphtheria has all but disappeared in many parts of the world. The last recorded case of respiratory diphtheria in the United States was in 1997, thanks to near universal childhood vaccination.
It's really one of the true successes of medicine and public health, that we have reduced the number of deaths from massive amounts to negligible numbers where we don't even remember that this is a disease and people don't even care about it. So we should celebrate that, right? But we should also remember that it is not gone, right? We have not eliminated or eradicated this disease.
Diphtheria still appears in places where access to vaccinations or antibiotics has been disrupted, like in refugee populations or in war zones, and it can be just as deadly as it once was. A 2011 outbreak in Nigeria killed roughly 40% of the children under 4 who got infected. Plus, over the last few years, the number of cases have been rising, thanks to disruptions to vaccination campaigns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine misinformation. According to the World Health Organization, there were over 25,000 reported cases of diphtheria in 2024 globally, which doesn't include the cases that went unreported.
I worry that if we continue to see these reducing trajectories, we might become at risk for these outbreaks again in the US. Like we've seen this in the past. Like this is what has happened in these outbreaks in Venezuela and Yemen and in the Rohingya, where they have this interruption in their access to vaccination that ends up causing an outbreak to occur because, the kids don't get vaccinated. We saw this with when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, that there was this massive outbreak throughout the former Soviet Union countries.
Part of the work Truelove and others are doing is figuring out how to respond if and when large outbreaks do occur. As
I mentioned, our diphtheria antitoxin is currently still produced using horses. One of the problems with that is that we have a global stockpile that does not meet the needs of a large-scale outbreak. How do we increase those numbers? But also, some of the work that we're doing now is really focused on how do we better use those small numbers in the cases where we actually need them.
The next time we run into another Nome situation, we definitely don't want to rely on any last-minute sled dog relays to save everyone. Sled dogs are remarkable animals. They've been our companions for at least 9,500 years. I'm sure history is full of stories worthy of adapting into a kids' movie or 3. And like Hollywood's human protagonists, sled dogs don't all have one look. Some are like your classic purebred husky, and some are like our new friend Flame. And yes, some are such mutts that they wind up being mistaken for a wolf dog. As different as all their special double coats appear though, they all share some pretty spectacular genetic adaptations. And it's thanks to those adaptations that over 100 years ago, all those dogs and mushers were able to brave the bitter cold and save a whole town from a horrible disease.